All right, guys. Why don't we get started? So I told you that we would start our AP review. Um, you guys obviously read the things that I put on Google Class, and I'm sure some of you have gone on the College Board website as well, and you know that they've heavily modified the exam, and in addition to it only being 45 minutes, and we're still waiting to hear exactly what the format's going to be. They said that it will be clarified for our specific exam at the latest on April 3rd. I have a feeling it's going to be short answer questions like the ones we've done, like a bunch of them, but I'm not sure. So I don't want to say for certain. But we do know that all of the content is going to stop at 1945, so I'm making the call that we're going to pause learning new content and we're going to focus on prepping for the exam now. Obviously, if we were going to have school, we would have been doing those after school reviews, but let's face it, with everything going on, I'm sure that everyone has enough on their plates where you don't want to be learning new content and reviewing for an AP exam, with some of the things being from even sophomore year. So we're going to stop new content. We're only going to review, and we're going to really put ourselves in a good position to clobber this test come May. And then once the exam is over, then we can go back and we'll finish American history. But as I've been saying all year, you only get one crack at this test. So I think that this is the best course of action to make sure that we are ready to go. I told you that that Monday was a prep day. So hopefully you got all your notes and things organized, and you also were able to get all of your login info for AP Classroom set up, because we're going to be using that, if not every day, almost every day from now on until the AP exam. They've put up a ton of really good resources, practice questions, things like that we're going to be using. So the way that I think we're going to format this is as follows. On day one of any section, I'll do an intro lecture, kind of like what we're about to do now, like the ones we've talked about. Then, depending on how long the topic is, we'll then go into some practice questions that the College Board provides us with. That'll be good for you to use with your notes and with my lectures. And then what we'll do is we'll host a video conference like we did last week. I know you guys said you want to do more of those. So after each unit, we'll do a video conference, or if we break the unit up, we'll do a couple. And that way you guys have some time to go over questions with me that you have. We'll actually go over the questions from the AP practice that I assign you as well, and we'll do that in real time. And I think that that'll put us in a good spot. I think I'm going to do the same thing that I did with the first video conference. We'll probably do an AM and a PM session. And you'll just have to make sure that you come to one or the other. One of them will be required. And we'll figure out how we set all that up going forward. But for now, let's get into the content, okay? So obviously this is Unit 1, Period 1, 1491 to 1607. You know that is referring to first contact, right? Right before Columbus. And then up to 1607, that's right when the English begin to establish the American colonies and really begin to take a lead in colonization compared to the other European powers. So this is going to be one of the shortest reviews. It's not a huge chunk of the exam, so it's a good place to start. So why don't we get into it? So when we talk about Native Americans before contact with Europeans, you know that Native Americans were not, one kind of homogenous group, right? You had hundreds of different tribes and dozens of different kind of cultural groups within those tribes. And then even, regionally, we saw all of the native tribes within those different areas kind of develop into distinct groups. So some of the bigger things that you need to, I think, take out of this have to do a lot with geography. The way that Native American tribes developed their cultures and their identities and their ways of surviving were rooted, not entirely, but primarily on the environment, all right? So you know that in the Midwest, or the modern Midwest, and also the American Southwest, most of the Native American tribes were nomadic, all right? They were hunter-gatherer societies. It was very hard to farm in those areas, So they relied primarily on hunting whatever the major game was of the area. The most famous, obviously, are the Plains tribes hunting the buffalo, um, or gathering, whatever kind of local, you know, like plants and kind of naturally occurring crops there were. But they were not farming societies by any means. As you work your way farther to the east, into like the Mississippi region and then to the East Coast with groups like the Iroquois. These are the societies that were much more sedentary. They didn't have fixed borders the way that we think of with the colonies or with countries, but they had established villages that were not going to move around. It's not like the Sioux on the Great Plains where the entire tribe moved. They had some agriculture. All right, the Iroquois in particular farmed quite a bit. But they still relied a lot on hunter-gatherer economies. All right, and as a result, when the Europeans come, this is actually one of the roots of the conflict. Is that these were pretty well-established societies, so they weren't going anywhere. Right. Now, when we get to the actual contact with the Europeans. The biggest thing, I think the most important thing that you got to take out of all of this has nothing to do with any one particular group. I'm sure that it's already popping into some of your heads, but the biggest concept or the biggest term that you need to take out of this is the Columbian Exchange, right? Which is very different from the triangle trade, all right? I know that you probably go, of course it's different. But I can't tell you how many people have mixed up the Columbian Exchange and the triangle trade over time. Okay, they're very different things. The triangle trade having to do with slavery and coming later. The Columbian Exchange having to do with a lot of the exchange initially of not just goods, but plants, animals, diseases, all of those things. So when we talk about the Columbian Exchange, I think big thing to take out of it is that generally speaking, the Europeans benefited from the Columbian Exchange and the Native Americans suffered from the Columbian Exchange. Okay. Europeans gained new crops. All right. Things like corn are probably the most famous. All right. But, hardy crops that they could grow, which not only sustained the colonies, but it also allowed the populations in Europe to grow because they introduced new crops that could survive there. They obviously gained access to new wildlife, either through hunting or through fishing off the American coast. And then also it allowed for tremendous economic expansion because colonies were big business. So it created a big boost in trade. It allowed manufacturing in Europe to be exported to the colonies. It allowed raw materials in the colonies to be exported back to Europe. And as well as things like mineral wealth. We'll talk about that with the Spanish in a second. Whereas for the Native Americans, while they were introduced to European technology and to some European goods, the number one thing that the Europeans brought to the Native Americans, which I'm sure you all remember, is disease, really. I mean, smallpox was estimated to have killed as much as 90% of the Native American population. And that complete lack of immunity to European diseases was really the most important part of the decline of not just North American, but all Native American societies in North, Central, or South America. Now, when we get to the individual colonial groups, obviously we focus a lot on the English because it's American history. But remember, the English were not the first, nor were they even the second in. The English were kind of late to the game. That the Spanish and the Portuguese really led colonization. That the Dutch and the French were in pretty quickly after, and the English were pretty late to this. Though obviously the English ultimately are the ones who really kind of take control, particularly in North America, right? So let's start at least with the Spanish. So when we look at the Spanish system, that the primary thing that the Spanish colonial system focused on was mineral extraction, right? The Spanish were the ones who were trying to accumulate as much gold and silver as they could and ship it back to Spain. The biggest kind of component of this was the encomienda system. If you remember that the encomiendas, this has to do with the Spanish colonies that were established. They would be rooted in kind of a combination of the Spanish military and the Catholic Church, right? So they would set up missions, which were kind of like forts with churches in them. The Spanish didn't really focus on bringing settlers. Very few actual Spaniards came in. And instead, what the Spanish encouraged was for their soldiers to either intermarry or have children with Native Americans, and it created this kind of new group within society where you had the pure Spanish, then you had the mestizos, which were kind of these this population group that was a mix through intermarriage, and then the Native Americans themselves. As a result of that, they created a caste system, which kind of defined you based on your race or ethnicity and essentially how much Spanish blood you had. So the more you had, the higher up in the system you were. And the Spanish were very aggressive about enslaving the Native American population. The Native Americans, at least initially in Spanish colonization, did the majority of the mining for gold, and all of the various kind of labor. But as the population began to decline due to disease, you also saw the Spanish be one of the first groups to start importing African slaves, which eventually comes to, obviously, as we know, dominate the English system, particularly in those southern colonies, right? Now, when you look at the French kind of had a very different model. Whereas the Spanish set up a lot of these kind of permanent settlements, but they were purely for resource extraction. The French took a much more conciliatory view towards the Native Americans. They focused on trade. They were willing to adapt their ideas and methods to cooperating with Native American tribes. They didn't try to impose religion or anything like that. So the French, while they had pretty vast territorial holdings, as you know, particularly in North America, the French didn't really attempt to subjugate the Native Americans. Instead, they relied on them as trading partners, particularly for furs. Remember, things like beavers were incredibly valuable at the time, right? Like beaver pelts would be shipped back to Europe, and it was one of the most profitable businesses that you could have. So the French saw cooperating with Native Americans as an opportunity. Same type of thing, though. The French didn't really bring a lot of colonists over. They had some, but nowhere near the Spanish or then ultimately the English, too. When the English come over, you know that the colonies themselves were primarily for, at least initially, economic gain, but also a place for religious dissidents, for people deemed undesirable, and also as a kind of like a safety valve for overpopulation in England. The colonies were seen as a place where they could go and either start a new life, or from the British government's perspective, get them out of their hair and make them less of a threat inside the country. So you saw the English population, while it started later, began to grow much, much quicker because they really focused on population. And they also, unlike the Spanish, who wanted to control Native American populations within their empire, and unlike the French, who wanted to work with Native American populations in their empire, the British wanted to, or the English wanted to push them out, right? They wanted to replace them. And that's one of the reasons why you see or if not the biggest reason, why you see the English model lead to a lot more of these conflicts and these wars. Now, there are some things that all of the various colonial groups shared in common in terms of their interactions with Native Americans. The first one, and in a lot of ways this is the way that all of the other kind of commonalities link, is that all of the Europeans looked at their cultures and their societies as being superior to the native cultures and societies. There's not a single case of a European power ever really looking at the Native Americans as equals. You know, I said the French were probably the most cooperative, but that was an opportunistic thing. They saw the Native Americans as being helpful in both potentially fighting European powers that they were competing with for territory, as well as the fur trade in particular, or even trade as a whole. So that kind of belief in European superiority is a big part. The second is a slogan you probably remember, which is that idea of God, gold, and glory, right? All of the Europeans, when they pushed to expand into the Americas, were looking to spread their religion, which at this point in time was going to be Christianity, some Protestant, some Catholic, but Christianity as a whole. Gold, is not just gold in a specific sense, but the idea of wealth, right? The British focused on growing cash crops, the French focused on the fur trade, and the Spanish focused on actual gold, but all of them have the idea of expanding the wealth of the not just individuals who were going over to the colonies, but also of the mother countries. And then glory. A really, I think, easy way to link this to something that we've talked about this year is, we've talked about nationalism and jingoism. Glory, in a lot of ways, in the colonial era is kind of that time period's version of like nationalism and jingoism. Colonies were a prestige thing. They allowed you to project power. The larger your empire, the more influential you were seen in the world. And there was a status idea there, right? We talked about other kind of empire slogans, like the sun never sets on the British Empire. Like all of this goes into the idea that all the European countries had a very firm belief that the bigger an empire they had, the more influential they could be and powerful they would be when dealing with other nations. And then also in a status sense, it was an idea that you were culturally superior if you were able to do this. And then last, I would say, is that even the French, who were the most cooperative, still exhibited some elements of attempting to dominate or subjugate Native Americans, with the British and the Spanish doing even more. At best, the Native Americans were temporarily useful to the Europeans. At worst, they were seen as a nuisance that needed to be either enslaved or eliminated immediately. And while we know the Spanish focused on enslavement, the British focused on elimination, and the French focused on kind of temporary exploitation or use before driving them out, none of these European societies ever seriously considered allowing Native Americans to remain with any degree of independence or freedom within the growing colonies. Okay, so like I said, this one was pretty short. What I'd like you guys to do is I'd like you guys to now go through and review not just your notes, but if you need to, go back and skim your textbook notes, your chapter outlines from last year, kind of getting into this. And then tomorrow, what we'll do is we will take a look at some practice questions. And then going forward on Thursday, we'll hold a video review where we look at the practice questions related to period 1. And we'll talk out some of the answers, both multiple choice and short answer, and make sure that we're all refreshed. If this one seems a little short, that's because it is. When we get into the colonial era and beyond, you'll see that these are in a lot more depth. But this is a pretty good one for a warm up to start. So I will talk to you guys soon, and good luck with your studying.